The air hangs thick over Tenochtitlan as the last light of day fades, replaced by the flickering glow of torches along the sacrificial pyramid. The distant sound of drums pulses like a heartbeat, echoing through the city's canals and stone temples. Shadowy figures move in silence, their robes rustling as they ascend the steps under a sky heavy with stars and smoke. This was no ordinary night. It was a night when the boundary between the mortal world and the divine grew thin, when the Aztecs believed the gods themselves leaned closer to listen. Imagine standing there, feeling the weight of centuries of tradition pressing down, the scent of copal incense mixing with something darker in the air. The Aztecs weren't just building an empire, they were sustaining a cosmic order, one ritual at a time. At the heart of their civilization lay a spiritual world so complex, so intertwined with daily life, that every decision, from planting crops to waging war, was guided by the will of the gods. But this wasn't a gentle faith. The Aztecs believed the universe demanded balance, and that balance came at a price: blood. Human sacrifice wasn't just a practice, it was the very foundation of their survival, a sacred exchange to keep the sun rising and the rains falling. To modern eyes, these rituals seem unthinkable, but to the Aztecs, they were as necessary as breathing. Their cosmology was a web of divine contracts where every offering, no matter how shocking, had a purpose. What if I told you that the rituals you've heard about, the beating hearts, the flayed skins, were just the beginning? Beneath the surface lay 30 darker, far more elaborate ceremonies, each with its own terrifying logic. Some were performed in secret, known only to the highest priests. Others unfolded in plain sight, designed to awe and terrify. These weren't random acts of violence. They were calculated, meticulously planned events meant to sustain an empire that ruled over millions. Over the next minutes, we'll step into that world, uncovering the truths behind these rituals, why they happened, how they were carried out, and what they reveal about the Aztecs' unshakable belief in their destiny. This isn't just history, it's a journey into the mind of a civilization that saw itself as the keepers of the cosmos. And trust me, by the end, you'll never look at ancient empires the same way again. The new fire ceremony was perhaps the most pivotal of all Aztec rituals, a moment when time itself seemed to hang in the balance. Every 52 years, as their sacred calendar completed a full cycle, the people of Tenochtitlan watched the night sky with a mixture of dread and hope. They believed the sun, weakened by its endless journey across the heavens, required a surge of life force to continue burning. If the priests failed to perform this ritual with absolute precision, the cosmos would collapse into eternal darkness. On the eve of the ceremony, every flame in the empire was extinguished: homes, temples, even the royal hearths plunged into cold blackness. The silence was total, broken only by the distant cries of warriors leading a captive to the summit of the Hill of the Star. There, under a sky thick with constellations, the high priest would raise an obsidian blade. As the victim's heart was torn out, the people held their breath. One spark from the friction of wooden sticks against the freshly opened cavity, and suddenly flame. It was said the fire serpent Zucotl, carved into temple walls and wielded as ceremonial torches, would carry this new fire from village to village, a blazing rebirth of the world. Artifacts from these ceremonies reveal the depth of their symbolism. The Zucotl, depicted with scales like flickering tongues of fire, wasn't just decoration, it embodied the transformative power of sacrifice. Even the victim's body, carefully rolled down the temple steps, became part of the ritual. The Aztecs saw this not as death, but as a sacred transaction, one life to ignite thousands more. To modern eyes, it's a horrifying spectacle, but to them, it was the difference between dawn and endless night. But the new fire ceremony was only the beginning of the Aztecs' intricate dance with the divine. When spring arrived and the first shoots of corn pushed through the earth, another terrifying ritual unfolded, one that blurred the line between man and God. The flayed skin dances were performed in honor of Tlaloc, the deity of renewal, whose very name meant "Our Lord the Flayed One." He was worshipped as the force behind nature's endless cycle of death and rebirth, and his festival demanded the ultimate tribute: human skins worn as living garments. After the sacrificial victim's heart was offered to the sun, priests would make careful incisions along the spine with razor-sharp obsidian knives, tools so precise that archaeologists have found them buried in temple caches, their edges still gleaming after centuries. The skin was peeled away in one piece, still warm and pliable, then handed to a waiting priest. For 20 days, these chosen men would wear the flayed hides like macabre second skins, the flesh drying and cracking as they danced through the streets. Ceramic sculptures from the era capture this haunting spectacle: figures with sagging, lifeless faces draped over their own, the empty eye sockets and gaping mouths of the dead staring out at the living. To the Aztecs, this wasn't grotesque, it was sacred theater. As the rotting skins split and fell away, they mirrored the shedding of husks from ripe corn, a visual promise that life springs from decay. Tlaloc himself was often depicted wearing a victim's skin, his golden body emerging fresh beneath it, proof that renewal required sacrifice. Even the act of flaying held deeper meaning. Just as seeds must break open to sprout, so too did human flesh need to be torn apart to feed the earth. The priests, clad in their grisly vestments, became walking symbols of this transformation, their dances a prayer for fertile fields and abundant harvest. The victims, often war captives chosen for their physical perfection, were believed to merge with the god through this ritual. Their suffering was a form of deification, their skins a temporary vessel for divine power. When the 20 days ended, the dried hides were buried in special pits beneath temple courtyards, returning their energy to the soil. Archaeologists have uncovered these burial sites, finding fragments of skin still clinging to ceremonial blades, silent witnesses to a belief system where beauty and horror, death and rebirth were forever intertwined. Even the children were not spared in the Aztecs' relentless quest to appease the gods. Among the most haunting rituals were those dedicated to Tlaloc, the storm deity whose weeping eyes brought rain to the fields. But these tears came at a terrible cost. His divine sorrow demanded an echo in the mortal world. The Aztecs believed that to summon the rains, they must offer him the most piercing sound of grief, the cries of children. Archaeologists digging at the Templo Mayor in modern Mexico City made a chilling discovery: dozens of small skeletons buried in clay jars, their bones stained with blue paint, the sacred color of Tlaloc. These weren't ordinary graves. The children, some as young as 3 or 4, were carefully arranged in fetal positions, surrounded by miniature tools and jade beads meant to serve them in the afterlife. Many showed signs of chronic illness, their teeth marked by lines of malnutrition, a clue that they may have been selected for their suffering, as their tears were thought to carry greater power. Spanish friar Diego de Ron, recording Aztec traditions in the 16th century, wrote of processions where sobbing families carried their children to the temple. The priests, clad in blue robes and masks resembling Tlaloc's bulging eyes, would take the infants and toddlers to the summit. There, as storms gathered overhead, the children's fingernails were ritually torn out to provoke wailing, a sound believed to call the rain. Some accounts describe even more horrific methods, from drowning in sacred springs to sealing the victims alive in caves, their final whimpers swallowed by the earth. What makes these rituals so unsettling is the duality of Tlaloc's worship. He wasn't a cruel god, but a necessary one. Without his rains, crops failed and cities starved. The blue-painted jars buried with the children weren't meant to desecrate but to honor, each one a vessel carrying a soul directly into the god's watery realm. Modern excavations have found remnants of copal incense and amaranth dough figurines beside the tiny bones, proof that these sacrifices were accompanied by prayers, not indifference. Yet the psychological toll on the families was immense. Duran recounts mothers pleading with priests to spare their children, only to be told refusal would bring drought and ruin. In Aztec art, Tlaloc is often shown with a split face, one side serene, the other monstrous, a reflection of the god's dual nature. He gave life but demanded it back in ways that tested the limits of devotion. The children's deaths were a paradox, an act of love for the community, wrapped in unimaginable grief. The sound of drumbeats and roaring crowds would have filled the air as players stepped onto the Tlachtli court, a sunken rectangular arena with slanted stone walls. This was no ordinary game, it was a sacred drama where the stakes were life and death. The rubber ball, heavy enough to fracture bones, symbolized the sun's movement across the sky, and every bounce echoed the cosmic struggle between light and darkness. Spectators packed the stands, betting jewels and textiles, while priests watched from elevated platforms, their eyes fixed on the players' every move. The most famous reliefs at Chichen Itza tell a chilling story. Carved panels show teams standing beside towering skull racks, their heads grotesquely tilted to mimic decapitation. For years, popular legends claimed the losers were automatically sacrificed, but the truth is far more complex. Surviving Aztec accounts describe the ball game as a ritual reenactment of mythical battles, where the losers were often honored volunteers, sometimes nobles or warriors, who saw their deaths as a direct pathway to the god's realm. Their decapitation mirrored the fate of the hero twins in Maya mythology, who were resurrected after losing their heads in the underworld. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence that complicates the narrative further. At some courts, like the one at Cantona, skeletal remains show signs of deliberate post-game execution, but the victims' ornate belts and jewelry suggest they were high-status individuals who may have viewed sacrifice as a privilege. Other sites reveal a darker twist. Some skulls bear marks of repeated healing, hinting at games where prisoners of war were forced to play until their final defeat. The Aztecs themselves wrote of matches where captives were tied to the ball, their bodies battered against the stone walls as part of the spectacle. The game itself was a masterpiece of symbolism. Players used only their hips to propel the ball, their padded belts resembling the womb of the earth goddess. Scoring points wasn't just about skill, it was a divine sign, a signal that the gods favored one team's spiritual strength over the others. When the final point was scored, the losing team didn't kneel in fear. They walked to the sacrificial stone with their heads high, believing their blood would nourish the fifth sun's fragile light. The skull racks weren't trophies of cruelty but sacred monuments, each cranium a vessel holding the energy of those who had crossed into the divine. Modern reconstructions of the game reveal its staggering physical demands. The rubber ball, weighing nearly 9 pounds, could reach speeds that shattered ribs or crushed skulls on impact. Players wore carved stone yokes around their waists to protect their organs, but injuries were inevitable. Some scholars argue that the sheer brutality of the game was part of its purpose, a way to weed out the weak before the final sacrifice, ensuring only the strongest souls were offered to the gods. The courts themselves were designed as portals to the underworld, their sloped walls channeling blood into drainage systems that fed the earth below. What's often forgotten is the ritual's aftermath. Decapitation wasn't the end. The severed heads were sometimes mounted on wooden frames and paraded through the city, their hollow eyes staring out as warnings and blessings. At El Tajan, murals show priests holding their heads aloft while sprouting plants emerge from their necks, a visual promise that death brought renewal. These weren't acts of senseless violence but carefully choreographed ceremonies, each movement steeped in meaning. The ballgame was a mirror held up to the Aztec world, reflecting their unshakable belief that every drop of blood spilled was a thread holding the universe together. The sacrificial stone was slick with blood as the high priest raised his weapon, not a crude tool of metal, but a meticulously crafted obsidian blade known as the tecpatl. In the flickering torchlight, its edges gleamed like black glass, sharper than any steel sword of the Spanish conquistadors. the Florentine Codex, a 16th century manuscript preserving Aztec knowledge, shows these rituals in chilling detail. Priests in elaborate feather headdresses pinning victims backward over the convex stone, their spines arched to expose the ribcage. With one practiced motion, the Tecpatl would plunge below the sternum, its razor edge sliding between ribs with surgical precision. Modern forensic anthropologists studying remains from the Templo Mayor have found matching cut marks on excavated rib bones, clean, angled incisions that reveal the terrifying efficiency of these ceremonies. The blade's position wasn't random. Aztec priests trained for years to locate the zihuatl, the precious turquoise. Their texts describe a poetic name for the still beating heart. Once extracted, it was placed in a ceremonial bowl called the Cuautlaxali, or eagle vessel, often carved with the raptor's gaping beak to symbolize the sun's ascent. Codex illustrations show how the heart would steam in the cold dawn air, its heat believed to carry prayers directly to the gods. What's rarely discussed is the biomechanics behind these acts. Obsidian, a volcanic glass, can form edges just 3 nanometers thick, 300 times sharper than a surgical steel scalpel. Researchers at Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology have replicated the technique using pig cadavers, confirming that the Aztec method required astonishing anatomical knowledge. The curved sacrificial stone wasn't just for spectacle. It forced the chest cavity open like a taut drumhead, minimizing resistance. Spanish accounts describe hearts being removed in under 12 seconds, a speed that speaks to grim expertise rather than brute force. The Cuautlaxali bowls themselves held deeper symbolism. Many were shaped like eagles in mid-flight, their wings forming the rim, a reference to the warrior spirits who accompanied the sun across the sky. Chemical analysis has detected traces of burnt copal and human blood in surviving examples, proving they weren't mere containers but active ritual objects. Some vessels even had internal channels, possibly to drain excess blood during ceremonies. The hearts themselves were often burned as offerings, but forensic evidence suggests certain rituals involved eating fragments of the tissue, a communion with divine energy that mirrored the Christian Eucharist the Spanish would later impose. Perhaps most haunting are the accounts of victims who survived the initial cut. The Florentine Codex describes some captives momentarily twitching after heart removal, their muscles still firing. Modern neurologists confirm this could happen if the brainstem remained oxygenated for those last seconds, meaning some victims may have been conscious as their hearts were raised toward the sun. The Aztecs saw these spasms not as agony but as sacred movement, the body's final dialogue with the gods. To them, every flutter of the dying heart was a word in a language we've forgotten how to hear. Even by Aztec standards, the Tenochtitlan massacre of 1487 was an event of staggering scale and brutality. Spanish chronicler Bernal Díaz del Castillo, who would later witness the aftermath of conquest, described rows of wooden skull racks stretching like grisly banners across the great plaza of Tenochtitlan, so many that he couldn't fathom counting them all. Modern estimates suggest as many as 4,000 victims were sacrificed over just 4 days, their blood cascading down the steps of the Templo Mayor in what may have been the single largest ritual slaughter in Mesoamerican history. But this wasn't just an act of devotion. The Tenochtitlan festival coincided with a critical moment in Aztec politics. Emperor Ahuitzotl, newly ascended to the throne, faced simmering dissent from neighboring city-states. The sheer spectacle of sacrifice served as a visceral warning, a proof of Tenochtitlan's divine mandate and military might. Victims weren't just prisoners of war, they were nobles from rival regions, their public executions a calculated display of dominance. What made Tenochtitlan unique was its choreography. Unlike other ceremonies, this one unfolded in relentless waves. Priests worked in shifts, their obsidian blades dulling so quickly that attendants kept spare knives glowing in ceremonial fires. The Florentine Codex depicts lines of captives ascending the pyramid, each forced to watch the person before them being dispatched, a psychological torment designed to break not just bodies but spirits. The political theater extended beyond the killings. Ahuitzotl ordered the skulls of sacrificed nobles mounted on a towering tees, ampantly, their hollowed sockets facing their homelands, a silent message carved in bone. Excavations in modern Mexico City have uncovered sections of this structure, the skulls drilled with holes where wooden beams once held them aloft. Some show signs of healing from past battlefield injuries, confirming they were warriors of high rank. Yet Tenochtitlan wasn't purely about terror. The festival honored Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, a god of fate who demanded perfection. Each victim spent a year living as his earthly embodiment, taught music and courtly speech before the final ritual. The Spanish misinterpreted this as deception, but Aztec texts reveal a deeper truth. These men weren't just killed, they were transformed. Their deaths marked the moment when the divine and mortal worlds briefly merged, their final screams echoing as prayers in the ears of the gods. The aftermath reshaped the empire. Neighboring rulers, witnessing the scale of sacrifice, either submitted or formed desperate alliances, laying the groundwork for the fragile coalition Cortés would later exploit. But Tenochtitlan's legacy wasn't just political. The event became a cultural touchstone, referenced in poetry as the flood that nourished the fifth sun. Even today, archaeologists sifting through the soil near the Zocalo find traces of copal and oxidized blood, remnants of a ritual that blurred the line between piety and power. Among the most intimate of Aztec sacrifices were the bloodletting rituals performed not on battle captives, but on the empire's own nobility. Museum cases today display spine-chilling relics of these ceremonies. Jade and obsidian bloodletters shaped like serpents or warriors, their edges still sharp enough to draw blood centuries later. These weren't tools of execution but instruments of devotion, used by kings and priests to forge a direct connection with the divine. Take the famous jade bloodletter housed in the British Museum, carved in the shape of a writhing rattlesnake. Its fangs form the blade, a design that mirrored the Aztec belief that serpent venom held transformative power. Moctezuma himself would have used such an instrument, piercing his tongue or earlobes during ceremonies depicted in codices like the Mendoza. The act wasn't quietly symbolic. Spanish accounts describe rulers passing cords through their wounds, threading them with thorns to maximize blood flow as they danced before crowds. The blood didn't just drip, it splattered onto bark paper later burned as sacred smoke, carrying noble essence straight to the gods. What's often overlooked is the precision behind these rituals. The Maya Dresden Codex shows similar ceremonies, but with a key difference: their nobles drew blood from genitals, believing it carried greater life force. Aztec rulers chose tongues and ears for strategic reasons. Tongue blood symbolized speech and wisdom, feeding deities like Huhuateotl, the old fire god. Ear blood represented listening, ensuring the gods would hear their prayers. Archaeologists have even found ceramic funnels designed to channel this blood directly into ceremonial bowls, proving these weren't token gestures but measured offerings. The pain was part of the ritual's power. Modern experiments with replica bloodletters reveal how the sting of jade, smoother than obsidian but slower to heal, created prolonged suffering. This wasn't accidental. Aztec texts describe ideal blood flow as a steady river, not a quick trickle. Some nobles enhanced their status by enduring more extreme versions, like threading 20 thorns through their skin before pulling them out in one agonizing motion. The scars became badges of honor, physical proof of devotion visible in portrait sculptures where earlobes are conspicuously stretched or mutilated. Perhaps most striking is how these rituals blurred the line between sacrificer and sacrificed. While commoners saw captive hearts offered to the gods, nobles participated in a deeper exchange, their own blood as currency in a divine economy. The very instruments used tell this story. Many bloodletters were heirlooms passed down through generations, their edges worn smooth by countless ceremonies. To hold one was to touch the accumulated piety of ancestors, each scratch on the jade marking another prayer etched into history. The contrast with Maya practices reveals a cultural divide. Where Maya rulers emphasized fertility through genital bloodletting, the Aztecs prioritized communication, a reflection of their empire's vast bureaucracy needing constant divine guidance. Spanish chroniclers mocked these acts as superstition, missing their political genius. When Moctezuma bled before his people, he wasn't just worshipping, he was performing kingship, demonstrating that even the most powerful man bowed to forces greater than himself. In a civilization where war captives died by the thousands, perhaps the most radical sacrifice was the one that left no corpse, just a nobleman standing tall, his blood staining the stones beneath him, proving that true power flowed both outward and inward. The Atamalcualistli festival transformed Lake Texcoco into a sacred stage where life and death played out on trembling canoes. For 8 days each year, priests dressed as water spirits pushed reed boats into the lake's dark waters, their movements mirroring the ebb and flow of Tlaloc's realm. But this wasn't just a pageant, it culminated in a ritual so chilling that Spanish chroniclers dubbed it the eating of water. Selected victims, often prisoners of war or slaves marked by physical imperfections believed to please the rain god, were forced into mock naval battles. Their arms bound with ritual cords, they'd struggle to stay upright as priests used oars to capsize the flimsy vessels, sending them plunging into the depths. Recent excavations along the lakebed have uncovered artifacts that bring this ceremony to life. Amphibian-shaped ceramic vessels, their wide mouths gaping like drowning men, were found clustered near ancient docking sites. Chemical analysis revealed traces of human blood mixed with algae inside these jars, suggesting they weren't just symbolic. They served as containers for offerings drawn from the drowned. The connection to Tlaloc was unmistakable. Frogs and salamanders depicted crawling along the rims of these vessels were his sacred messengers, creatures that bridged the worlds of water and land. What makes Atamalcualistli uniquely terrifying was its slow, deliberate cruelty. Unlike the swift heart removals atop pyramids, drowning was a prolonged ordeal, the victims thrashing limbs mimicking the chaotic motion of storms. Aztec texts describe priests timing these sacrifices to coincide with incoming rains, the victims' final gasp swallowed by thunder. Some accounts mention weighted stones tied to ankles, ensuring the bodies sank to Tlaloc's underwater palace rather than floating back to the mortal world. Archaeologists diving near the ancient city of Tenochtitlan have found eerie proof of this practice, skeletons still anchored by basalt blocks, their bones stained green from centuries in mineral-rich water. Even more unsettling are the jade beads placed in their mouths, a final payment for safe passage to the god's domain. The Spanish misinterpreted these as mere superstition, but modern scholars recognize the sophistication behind the symbolism. Just as water erodes stone yet gives life, the Aztecs saw drowning not as annihilation but as transformation. The victim's breath becoming mist, their blood merging with the lake that fed an empire. The festival's climax came when priests collected water from the drowning sites in those frog-shaped vessels, now believed to represent Tlaloc's receptacles for human essence. These waters were then sprinkled over crops, completing the sacred cycle. Life taken from the lake returned to the land. In a civilization where drought meant famine, Atamalcualistli wasn't brutality for its own sake. It was a desperate dialogue with forces beyond human control, conducted in a language we barely understand today. Beneath modern Mexico City's bustling streets, archaeologists made a discovery that froze the blood, a towering cylinder of human skulls buried for centuries near the Templo Mayor. This was no ordinary burial. Using 3D scanning technology, researchers reconstructed the original structure, a massive rack called the Huites Ampantli, its wooden beams once supporting row after row of craniums arranged in perfect concentric circles. The scale defies comprehension, 650 skulls in just one section, their empty eye sockets staring outward like a macabre mosaic of death. But what's truly chilling isn't just the number, it's the diversity. forensic analysis revealed men, women, and even children, their bones marked by signs of ritual trauma. Precise cuts from obsidian blades, fractures from ceremonial clubs, and in some cases, evidence of healing from earlier wounds. Spanish accounts, long dismissed as exaggeration, suddenly gained credibility when conquistador Andrés de Tapia described counting 136,000 skulls across multiple racks. Modern scholars now believe his math wasn't far off. The Aztecs maintained these displays like living ledgers, constantly adding new trophies from battles and sacrifices. The skulls weren't just tossed haphazardly, they were meticulously curated. Some were drilled through the temples with holes for wooden rods, allowing them to slide onto frames like beads on an abacus. Others were cemented together with a mortar made of lime and human blood, creating gruesome architectural columns that still stand today in the archaeological record. What most reconstructions miss is the sensory horror of these sites. Imagine walking past the Tenochtitlan at the height of its use, the stench of decaying flesh mixing with copal incense, the buzzing of flies, the way sunlight would filter between the rows, casting shifting shadows that made the skulls seem to whisper. The Aztecs saw this not as a place of terror but of power. Each skull represented a life transformed into sacred energy, a battery sustaining the cosmos. Spanish friar Bernardino de Sahagún recorded that some racks had dedicated accountants who tracked incoming skulls, their tally marks echoing the very calendars that dictated when the next sacrifices would come. Recent isotopic testing on the teeth of these skulls tells an even darker story. Many victims weren't locals but brought from hundreds of miles away, proof of the Aztec Empire's reach and the deliberate transportation of captives for ritual purposes. Some show signs of prolonged malnutrition before death, suggesting they were kept in holding pens for months. Others bear intricate dental decorations with jade inlays, marking them as nobles sacrificed during politically charged ceremonies. The Tenochtitlan wasn't just a religious statement, it was a geopolitical one. When subject kingdoms sent tribute payments of gold and feathers, they also sent captives, their own people, to feed the insatiable racks of Tenochtitlan. Yet there's a haunting beauty in the craftsmanship. The outer layers of skulls were often arranged in decorative patterns, zigzags representing lightning, circles mirroring the sun's path. Some had been painted with ochre or adorned with strips of bark paper inscribed with the victim's name and origin. These weren't anonymous trophies but individualized offerings, each with a story swallowed by time. Modern imaging techniques have even detected traces of plant matter in the cranial cavities, remnants of flowers or herbs placed inside as final offerings. The Aztecs understood something modern societies often forget, that death, no matter how brutal, could still hold meaning, still be wrapped in ceremony. As archaeologists continue excavating the site, they've uncovered something unexpected: repair marks. Some skulls show where fragments were reattached with resin, evidence that the Tenochtitlan required maintenance. Over years of exposure, skulls would crack or weather, and priests would painstakingly mend them, preserving the display's terrifying splendor. It's a detail that changes everything. This wasn't just a pile of bones, it was a living monument cared for like a sacred garden where the flowers were human faces. The Spanish described burning these racks during the conquest, but now we know the truth. You can't erase a culture's beliefs by destroying its artifacts. The Tenochtitlan endures not just in museum cases, but in the collective memory of a civilization that dared to stare into the void and call it divine. Night falls over Tenochtitlan as a strange scent drifts through the plaza. Thick, cloying, the unmistakable aroma of fermented honey wine. At the center of the crowd stands a towering pine pole, its bark stripped away to reveal smooth wood glistening with resin. This is the Xochitl fire pole, and the man swaying at its base is no ordinary climber. His pupils are dilated, his movements sluggish from the gallons of balshé he's been forced to drink. A ritual intoxication described in vivid detail by Spanish friar Bernardino de Sahagún. The concoction wasn't just alcohol, it was laced with hallucinogenic herbs, turning the victim's world into a dizzying haze as priests tied ropes around his waist and ankles. Ceramic effigies of Huhuoteotl, the ancient fire god, watched from nearby altars. These weren't generic idols, each was crafted with terrifying precision. Some show the deity hunched over, his back bent under the weight of years, mouth stretched in a silent scream as flames lick his spine. Others depict him wearing a brazier like a crown, the fire eternally consuming his own head. The victim would have seen these figures looming in his blurred vision as the priests handed him a wooden mallet and pointed upward. At the pole's summit, waiting just out of reach, dangled a dough effigy shaped like an eagle, the symbol of the sun. The climb itself was a grotesque parody of human effort. Each handhold had been coated in pine resin mixed with crushed glass fragments, slicing the drunk man's palms as he scrambled for purchase. Sahagun's accounts describe how the crowd roared when the climber slipped, his body jerking against the ropes as blood streaked the pole. But this wasn't mere spectacle, every drop was sacred. The resin ensured his blood wouldn't drip wastefully to the ground, but instead bake onto the wood, becoming part of the ritual object. Halfway up, the true horror began. Attendants on the ground lit bundles of pitch-soaked reeds, thrusting them against the pole's base. Flames raced upward, following the resin trails like fuse cords. Now the victim wasn't just climbing, he was racing the fire, his drunken stupor melting into primal terror. Museum collections preserve similar poles from other sites, their surfaces still blackened with ancient scorch marks, embedded with tiny bone fragments where flesh met burning wood. At the moment the flames caught him, the symbolism crystallized. The drunk man became Huhuoteotl himself, the old god who carried fire on his back, whose very name meant the ancient one who consumes himself. His death wasn't an ending but a transformation, his screams merging with the crackle of the blaze to become the god's voice. Excavations at Tlaloc have uncovered ceramic drums painted with scenes from this ritual, showing musicians playing feverishly as the burning body plunged back to earth, trailing smoke like a fallen star. The aftermath was just as calculated. The charred remains were gathered in clay urns shaped like Huhuoteotl's face, their wide mouths symbolizing the gateway between worlds. Modern chemical analysis of these vessels reveals traces of burnt corn and cocoa, offerings to sweeten the victim's journey. Even the pole itself became sacred. Some were carved into effigies and kept in temples, their surfaces polished smooth by generations of reverent touches. The Aztecs saw no contradiction in the brutality and the beauty to them. The Xochitl fire pole was a ladder between realms, its rungs slick with blood and meaning. The streets of Tenochtitlan lay unnaturally still before dawn on the first day of Ochpanistli, the festival of sweeping. Not a single footprint marked the freshly raked earth of the ceremonial plaza, an intentional emptiness, a blank slate waiting for the ritual to come. At its center stood a woman dressed in the flowing robes of Tosai, the grandmother goddess of healing and midwifery, her arms adorned with strands of cotton representing spiderwebs. For 40 days she had lived as the deity's embodiment, blessing crops and curing the sick, but now her final role awaited. The brooms leaning against the temple steps weren't ordinary tools. Their handles were carved from bones of past sacrifices, the bristles woven from human hair saved from previous Ochpanistli ceremonies. When the sun crested the temples, the sweeping began. The Tosai impersonator moved through the city with a procession of priestesses, her broom scattering cornmeal and powdered ochre in spiraling patterns. Spanish chronicler Diego de Ron described how her movements weren't random, each stroke followed sacred geometry, clearing spiritual debris from the pathways gods would later walk. The true horror came at the ritual's climax, as the woman knelt before the temple of Chichimequotl, the maize goddess. Priests raised a wooden sword lined with obsidian flakes. Unlike the quick heart removals of other sacrifices, this beheading was deliberately slow, the blade sawing through the neck to maximize blood flow over the waiting brooms below. What happened next reveals the ritual's deeper symbolism. The victim's hair was immediately shorn and woven into new broom fibers, mixing with the hair of previous tossers in an unbroken chain stretching back generations. These weren't mere cleaning tools. Murals at Teotihuacan show similar brooms sprouting cornstalks, their bristles transforming into roots. The act of sweeping afterward wasn't about dirt, it was a reenactment of cosmic creation, the bristles tracing the paths of stars as blood-seasoned fibers fertilized the earth. Modern excavations near the Templo Mayor uncovered a cache of these ritual brooms, their strands still matted with hemoglobin centuries later, but the ceremony's brilliance lay in its duality. While the impersonator died as Tosai, she was simultaneously honored as Tlaloc, the earth monster who birthed the moon and stars. The sweeping motions cleansed the city not just physically but temporally, symbolizing the Aztec belief that time itself needed periodic renewal. Even the direction mattered. Priests always swept east to west, mirroring the sun's journey. Some brooms had hollow handles filled with seeds that scattered during use, literally planting the future with each stroke. The victim's flayed skin completed the cycle. A chosen priest would wear it while dancing through the streets, his movements mimicking an old woman stooped with age. This grisly costume wasn't meant to terrify but to comfort. The Aztecs saw it as Tosai herself walking among them one last time before her transformation. By nightfall, the skin would be buried in a seed granary, its decaying flesh believed to protect the next harvest. The entire ritual was a masterpiece of agricultural metaphor, death becoming a broom becoming a crop, and a crop ensuring life continued. Perhaps most striking is how opportunistically inverted normal Aztec sacrifice. Where most victims were warriors or nobles, the Tosai impersonator was often a slave or criminal, her past sins symbolically swept away with the old year. The Spanish fixated on the violence, missing the profound optimism beneath the belief that no soul was beyond redemption, that even the lowliest could become sacred. When archaeologists recently analyzed hair from excavated brooms, they found traces of henna and flower oils, proof these women were pampered before their deaths, treated as goddesses right up to the final moment. The sweeping wasn't an end, but a beginning, one last act of cleaning the world before it could start anew. The chosen one stood at the crossroads between mortal and divine, his skin painted blue, his head crowned with heron feathers, his every movement watched by priests who bowed as he passed. This was no ordinary captive. For one full cycle of the Aztec calendar, he had lived as Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, walking among men with the grace of a god. The Spanish called these figures Ixtla, god impersonators, but the term fails to capture their sacred transformation. They weren't merely actors in a ritual drama, they became vessels for divine presence, their humanity slowly erased as the year progressed. From the moment of selection, the impersonator's life was a meticulously crafted performance, chosen for physical perfection, unblemished skin, strong limbs, a voice that could carry prayers. He was whisked away to a life of luxury and instruction. The Florentine Codex describes his days filled with music lessons, learning to play the flute as skillfully as Tezcatlipoca himself. He was taught the speech of nobles, the posture of kings, even the art of arranging flowers in sacred patterns. 4 wives representing fertility goddesses were given to him, their union blessed as a microcosm of cosmic harmony, but the most haunting detail, the golden bells. During his final procession through Tenochtitlan, the Ixtla wore anklets strung with tiny gold chimes that rang with every step, a sound believed to mimic celestial music. Archaeologists have unearthed these very bells at the Templo Mayor, their delicate clappers still intact after 5 centuries. The effect was hypnotic. As he climbed the pyramid steps, the tinkling grew fainter, marking his transition from earthly to divine. The sacrifice itself was shockingly intimate. Unlike the mass ceremonies atop the Great Pyramid, Tezcatlipoca's Ixtla met his end alone, surrounded only by high priests. As he broke his ceremonial flute on the steps, a symbolic severing of ties to the mortal world, the blade that took his heart was made not of obsidian but of gleaming gold, a metal sacred to the gods. His final breath wasn't a scream but whispered poetry, echoing Tezcatlipoca's own mythical words from the Codex Chimalpopoca. "I am the wind that walks the night, the shadow that never sleeps." What unsettles modern scholars isn't the violence but the willing participation. Surviving accounts suggest many Ixiptla embraced their fate, even composing songs of gratitude as the year waned. In a civilization where gods bled to create the sun, becoming divine even briefly was the highest honor. The four wives would mourn not as widows but as priestesses, their tears believed to fertilize the earth. And when the next Ixiptla was chosen, he would inherit not just the role but the very bells that had marked his predecessor's ascent, each chime carrying the weight of every man who had walked this path before. The air thrummed with anticipation as the procession wound through Tenochtitlan streets during Panquetzalistli, the festival of the raised banners. Towering above the crowd, priests carried an effigy of Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird god of war, his wooden frame adorned with iridescent feathers that caught the sun like shards of polished obsidian. But the true focus lay ahead, a captive, stripped bare and bound to a wooden scaffold, his body painted with stripes of chalk and ochre to mimic the markings of an eagle in flight. This was no ordinary execution. It was a reenactment of the ancient myth of the descending eagle, a ritual so precise that the Codex Borbonicus captures its every chilling detail in vibrant pigments that still glow centuries later. The victim's arms were stretched wide, tethered to the scaffold's crossbeam with ropes coated in tree sap to prolong the struggle. Archers, chosen from the warrior elite, took their positions 20 paces away, their bows strung with cords woven from human hair for symbolic potency. The first arrow struck just below the ribcage, not a mortal wound, but a deliberate opening act. As the crowd roared, each subsequent archer aimed for limbs and torso, avoiding vital organs in a macabre display of control. The Codex illustrates this moment with haunting clarity. The victim's body bristling with feathered shafts like some grotesque human cactus, his face contorted not in agony but ecstasy, embodying the Aztec belief that pain was the highest form of communion. What made this ritual unique was its theatrical pacing. Unlike swift heart extraction, the descending eagle method prolonged suffering to mirror Huitzilopochtli's mythical battle against the stars. Each arrow represented a celestial enemy, the victim's blood droplets symbolizing falling stars vanquished by the sun god's might. Forensic analysis of similar remains at Tlaloc reveals arrowheads lodged in bone without fatal trauma, proof of calculated, non-lethal targeting. Some victims survived for hours before the final shot pierced the heart, timed to coincide with the sun's zenith when Huitzilopochtli's power peaked. The scaffold itself held deeper meaning. Carved from sacred Ahuhuit wood, its base was shaped like an eagle's talons, gripping a stone disc painted with the 4 cardinal directions. As blood pooled on this surface, priests would collect it in ceremonial bowls shaped like open beaks, vessels later used to anoint newborn warriors. Even the arrows were ritually significant. Their shafts, made from reeds harvested at the height of the rainy season, contained hollow channels designed to maximize blood flow, turning each impact into a gruesome irrigation system for the earth below. Spanish chronicler Diego Durán described how spectators would catch the falling blood on strips of amatil paper, pressing them against their children's foreheads as blessings. The victim's final moments were choreographed to perfection. When his head finally lolled forward, a priest would scale the scaffold to sever the ropes, letting the body crash onto a bed of crushed cactus spines, a symbolic return to the earth that birthed Huitzilopochtli. This wasn't mere cruelty, it was cosmic theater, every drop of blood a line in a prayer older than Tenochtitlan itself. Recent excavations near the Templo Mayor uncovered a cache of these ritual arrows, their obsidian tips still stained with hemoglobin. What shocked researchers wasn't their sharpness but their variety, some barbed to tear flesh on extraction, others smooth for clean wounds. Each type served a purpose in the sacred narrative, from the star-piercing arrows to the final, sunstroke projectile that ended the performance. The victim's flayed skin would later be worn by a dancer representing the ascending eagle, completing the cycle of sacrifice and rebirth. In the Aztec world, even death had choreography. The waters of Lake Texcoco churned thick and white as priests poured sack after sack of ground maize into the shallows, transforming the sacred lake into a swirling, otherworldly gruel during the Quetzalcoatlistli festival. This wasn't mere ceremony, it was a calculated act of alchemy, turning the lake's depths into a bridge between the human and divine. Victims, their limbs weighted with stones carved with Tlaloc's bulging eyes, were led into the chalky water as chanting rose from the shore. The maize flour served a cruel dual purpose. It thickened the water to slow their struggling, while symbolically binding their fate to the crops their deaths would nourish. Modern divers exploring the lakebed have uncovered eerie remnants of these rituals, stone anchors shaped like Tlaloc's fanged mouth still tethered to skeletal remains, their rib cages packed with caked maize that preserved like concrete in the anaerobic mud. More disturbing are the ceramic effigies found nearby, miniature Tlalocs with hollow bellies that once held corn kernels mixed with the victim's fingernail clippings, a recipe for fertility spelled out in Aztec codices. These weren't tossed haphazardly but arranged in precise grids mirroring crop fields, underwater replicas of the farms they were meant to bless. The duality of Tlaloc emerges starkly in these finds. His realm wasn't just about life-giving rain but the terrifying forces beneath the surface whirlpools, sudden storms, the lake's insatiable hunger for offerings. Children's skeletons found in adjacent sites show teeth marks from lake fish, proof that some victims were left exposed to the elements in a final act of unification with the god's domain. Yet the same hands that weighed these bodies down also placed jade beads in their mouths, precious stones representing water's purity, ensuring the dead became honored messengers rather than discarded refuse. Perhaps most revealing is the chemical analysis of the submerged maize itself. The flour wasn't ordinary cornmeal but mixed with ashes from previous sacrifices, creating a ghastly batter that connected each new victim to a chain of rituals stretching back generations. When Spanish chroniclers described the water turning red during Quetzalcoatlistli, they missed the deeper horror. It wasn't just blood staining the lake, but the slow dissolution of countless bodies over centuries, their particles blending with the maize to form a primordial soup of renewal. The victims didn't just drown, they became part of the very substance that would later be scooped from the lake to bless the planting season, their essence sewn back into the earth they died to feed. The Tonalpohualli wasn't just a calendar, it was a sacred blueprint, a 260-day cycle pulsing like a heartbeat beneath every Aztec ritual. Unlike our modern solar-based systems, this count of days intertwined with the cosmos itself, each date carrying its own divine signature demanding specific sacrifices. The Borgia Codex, that breathtakingly preserved screenfold manuscript, reveals these intricate patterns in vivid pigments, pages upon pages of day signs coiled around gods, their colors still vibrant after centuries. Jaguars and eagles, flowers and flint knives, each symbol wasn't merely decorative but a direct instruction from the gods. Take the day, one rain, depicted as a single droplet striking an open hand. On these dates, the air in Tenochtitlan grew heavy with the scent of wet earth and copal incense, as priests scoured the city for the chosen offering, children. These weren't random selections. The codex shows toddlers with their hair shorn in the style of Tlaloc's priests, their cheeks painted blue to mimic the rain god's tears. Why children? The answer lies in the Aztec belief that their tears held unique power. Just as raindrops begin small before swelling into storms, a child's weeping was thought to carry the purest echo of Tlaloc's own sorrow, a divine resonance that would summon the heaviest downpours. The preparations were chilling in their precision. Days before the sacrifice, selected children were bathed in sacred springs, their bodies rubbed with oils mixed with ground jadate to make them shimmer like living water. Spanish chronicler Bernardino de Sahagún recorded mothers dressing their children in paper wings, transforming them into human butterflies destined to flutter into Tlaloc's embrace. When the moment came, priests carried them to elevated shrines, often hilltops or temple platforms, where their cries would carry farthest. The Borgia Codex illustrates the final act with haunting simplicity. A priest holding a child over a vessel shaped like Tlaloc's gaping mouth, the rain glyphs swirling around them like a storm made visible. But one rain was just one thread in a vast tapestry of ritual timing. Days marked 7 flower demanded the sacrifice of poets and musicians, their songs offered to Xochipilli, the flower prince. 12 wind called for the blood of captured warriors, their deaths mirroring the god Ehecattl's breath that swept across battlefields. The calendar didn't merely schedule these acts, it encoded a deeper logic. Each sacrifice aligned with celestial events. Venus's appearance might dictate a flint knife's use, while the moon's phase determined whether a victim's blood would be collected in jade bowls or sprinkled directly onto the earth. Archaeologists have uncovered proof of this meticulous timing. At the Templo Mayor, offerings buried beneath the rain god's shrine contained child-sized bones interred with tiny ceramic rain drums, all excavated from layers corresponding to one rain dates in surviving calendars. Even more telling, the positioning of these burials. Unlike the chaotic piles of skulls from mass sacrifices, these children were laid carefully on their sides, knees drawn up as if sleeping, surrounded by shells from distant oceans Tlaloc's domain. Their mouths often held beads of blue-green resin, a final prayer sealed between their lips. The Tonopouhualli's true genius lay in its flexibility. While solar calendars rigidly marked seasons, this sacred count could adapt, its days cycling independently to address immediate divine demand. A drought might prompt extra one-rain ceremonies, while a military defeat could trigger unscheduled sacrifices on 5-knife days. The Borgia Codex even includes correction pages, adjustments made by priests when omens signaled the gods required recalibration. This wasn't superstition, it was a living system as precise and adaptable as the rituals it governed. Perhaps most striking is how these dates still resonate. Modern meteorologists studying Mexico's rainfall patterns have noticed an eerie trend. Peaks in precipitation often align with ancient one-rain dates, centuries after the last child sacrifice. Whether coincidence or something more mysterious, it's a reminder that the Aztecs weren't just keeping time. They were conversing with it, their calendar a bridge between human desperation and the indifferent forces of nature. Every drop of blood, every tear shed, was a single syllable in that ongoing dialogue. The city center shook as the massive trunk of the Cuahuitl tree was dragged into place, its bark stripped away to reveal pale wood glistening with sacrificial blood. This wasn't just lumber, it was the Axis Mundi, the world tree connecting earth to heavens, and its erection would claim lives in one of the Aztecs' most spectacularly brutal ceremonies. Dominican friar Diego Duran, witnessing the aftermath in the 1570s, described the event with horrified fascination. Captives were forced to lie in shallow trenches as teams of warriors used ropes to haul the 50-foot log upright, its base positioned directly over their chests. The victims didn't just die, they were slowly compressed as the tree's unimaginable weight crushed ribcage inward, their final breaths escaping as wheezing prayers to Tlaloc, the earth monster whose gaping jaws welcomed the sinking log. Surviving Huehuetl drums tell this story in haunting relief. One housed in Mexico's National Museum of Anthropology shows the tree-raising scene carved around its circumference, figures with distended bellies and popping eyes mirroring actual trauma patterns seen in forensic examinations of similar remains. These weren't ordinary musical instruments but sacred amplifiers, their hollow bodies believed to channel the victims' dying screams into the spirit world. When struck with human bone mallets during the ceremony, their deep tones reportedly synchronized with the cracking of sternums beneath the rising log. The ritual's true terror lay in its prolonged agony. Unlike swift heart extraction, the Huitl method extended suffering to mirror the cosmic struggle between earth and sky. Doron's account mentions some victims surviving for hours as the log settled, their ruptured lungs filling with blood while priests danced around them wearing bark paper soaked in their frothing breath. Modern engineers calculating the physics estimate the tree's weight at nearly 3 tons, enough to collapse a chest cavity in minutes, but deliberately raised inch by inch to maximize torment. What most Spanish chroniclers missed was the ceremony's agricultural symbolism. The trenches where victims lay were dug in precise alignment with the 4 directions, their bodies forming living foundations for the world tree. As their blood seeped into the soil, it activated what the Aztecs called Tlaloc, the sacred energy of decomposition that fertilized crops. The drum patterns played during the raising weren't random either. Linguists analyzing colonial-era notations found they matched the rhythmic structure of Nahuatl planting chants, turning human suffering into an auditory seed. The tree itself became a sacred relic after the ceremony. Archaeologists have found post holes near the Templo Mayor containing fragments of human bone and resin traces of these ritual timbers that were left standing until they rotted. Some were carved into effigies of Tlaloc, their surfaces stained dark from years of blood offerings. The most chilling discovery came in 2014, when researchers excavating near Tlaloc uncovered a massive stump still impaled with a sacrificial knife. Its growth rings showed it had been cut down during the spring equinox, then kept alive for months by priests who watered its roots with blood, a living bridge between worlds until the day it crushed its final victims. Perhaps the most unsettling detail comes from Doron's notes on the victims' selection. They weren't war captives but volunteers from noble families chosen for their unbroken bones, a physical purity believed to strengthen the cosmic axis. Their deaths were seen as the ultimate act of nobility, their compressed bodies becoming literal supports holding up the Aztec world. When archaeologists recently analyzed soil from these sites, they found startling evidence the Aztecs were right in one grim sense. The calcium from crushed bones had indeed enriched the earth, leaving patches of abnormally fertile ground that still produce bumper crops 5 centuries later. The air in Tenochtitlan grew thin and brittle during Izcalli, the month of growth when the city held its collective breath. This was no ordinary fast, it was a deliberate starvation, a slow unraveling of the body to prepare it for what came next. For 30 days, selected victims endured a forced asceticism, their diets reduced to nothing but sips of water and the occasional handful of toasted amaranth grains. The Florentine Codex describes how their cheeks hollowed, their skin tightening over ribs like parchment over drum frames, their bodies transforming into living vessels of deprivation. But this wasn't neglect, it was alchemy. The Aztecs believed the process purified flesh, making it worthy to wear the skin of gods. Modern science has given us an unsettling window into this practice. Bioarchaeologists studying remains from the Templo Mayor precinct found telltale Harris lines, dense ridges in long bones that formed during cycles of starvation and partial recovery. Some victims showed evidence of childhood malnutrition followed by periods of feast, a pattern suggesting they were chosen specifically for their ability to endure prolonged hunger. Even more chilling, the isotopic signatures in their teeth revealed abrupt shifts from protein-rich diets to near-total carbohydrate deprivation in their final months. These weren't just captives, they were carefully conditioned offerings, their bodies methodically broken down like ritual objects being polished for use. The final act blurred the line between sacrifice and sacrament. When the fast ended, priests performed the Tlaloc puerilistly, the flaying ceremony, but with a grim twist. Unlike typical rituals where the skin was removed in one piece, the Izcalli victims' emaciated state made their hides tear like wet papyrus. Some scholars argue this was intentional. The Codex Magliobrchiano shows flayed skins hanging in tatters from wooden frames, their gaps resembling the fissures in drought-stricken earth. The Aztecs saw this fragmentation as symbolic. The bodies surrendered to divine forces piece by piece. Then came the controversy that still divides researchers today: ritual cannibalism. Spanish accounts described priestly elites consuming small portions of the victim's flesh, but modern interpretations vary wildly. Chemical analysis of cooking vessels from elite residences found traces of human myoglobin, a protein found in muscle tissue alongside chili peppers and cocoa. Yet the quantities were minuscule, leading some scholars to propose it wasn't about nutrition but transubstantiation, a literal ingestion of sacred energy. Others point to nearby animal bones showing identical cut marks, suggesting possible contamination or ceremonial mixing of substances. The truth may lie in between. Ceramic figurines from the period showed deities with half-human, half-corn features, hinting at a symbolic blurring of flesh and crop, where consuming a fragment was like eating the first fruit of harvest. What makes Izcalli uniquely unsettling isn't just the physical torment but the psychological dimension. The victims weren't passive, they participated in their own transformation. Murals at Teotihuacan depict similar fasting figures weaving their own death shrouds, their eyes eerily serene. Some Egyptologists compare it to the self-denial of Osirian cults, but the Aztecs took it further. These weren't hermits seeking enlightenment, they were living canvases, their wasting bodies a slow-motion performance of devotion. When the flaying knives finally bit into their flesh, the Aztecs believed they weren't killing them but releasing them, the way a farmer breaks open the earth to plant seeds. Their starvation wasn't cruelty but the ultimate act of reciprocity, the body returning what the earth had given, calorie by agonizing calorie. Recent excavations near Texcoco uncovered a network of fasting chambers beneath temple complexes, small, windowless cells with floors sloped to drain bodily fluids. The walls still bear finger grooves where victims clutched at stone during hunger pangs, their desperation literally etched into the architecture. Yet these same rooms contained beautiful murals of sprouting maize, their vibrant greens and yellows painted with mineral pigments mixed with the victim's own saliva, a final artistic act signed in biological ink. The message was clear: even in deprivation there was creation. The fast didn't just empty them, it made them into something new. Theological debates still rage over whether Izcalli victims achieved deification or annihilation. Their flayed skins, often stretched over corn husk effigies and paraded through fields, suggest a kind of rebirth. But forensic evidence hints at darker possibilities. Some skulls show premortem fractures inconsistent with ritual killing, perhaps indicating merciful blows to end suffering. The truth may be both. In Aztec cosmology, the line between honoring and consuming was always thin. Just as maize must die to feed the living, these men and women crossed the threshold not as corpses but as latent energy, their bones planted in temple foundations like kernels in sacred soil. When modern farmers in the valley report especially bountiful harvests near ancient sites, one wonders, was it the earth's natural richness or the last gift of those who starved so the world might eat? The streets of Tenochtitlan fell silent as the sun dipped below the horizon during Miquelhuatl, the Night of the Dead. Unlike today's vibrant Dia de Muertos, where marigolds and sugar skulls celebrate ancestors with joyful remembrance, this ancient observance carried a far grimmer weight. The Aztecs didn't just honor the dead, they fed them, offering blood to sustain the fragile boundary between worlds. Victims clad in delicate paper garments, their faces painted with ash to resemble skulls, were led through torchlit processions. These weren't mere costumes. The paper, made from beaten fig bark and soaked in ritual resins, was designed to burn slowly when lit, a metaphor for the soul's gradual release. Recent excavations at Tlaloc unearthed chilling evidence of these ceremonies. Dozens of miniature clay skulls, each no larger than a child's fist, arranged in concentric circles around burial pits. Forensic analysis revealed traces of human blood in the clay's pores, proving these weren't symbolic tokens but ritual containers for the essence of the sacrifice. The skull's hollow eyes and gaping jaws mirrored the dead's hunger, their surfaces incised with glyphs naming specific ancestors who required nourishment. Spanish chronicler Bernardino de Sahagún described how priests would fill these cavities with a paste of ground maize and sacrificial blood, then seal them with wax before burying them facing west, the direction of the underworld. The killings themselves were eerily theatrical. Victims, chosen for their resemblance to deceased nobles, were dressed in the exact clothing of the departed, down to the last feather ornament. As drums pulsed in the darkness, priests used obsidian blades to make precise cuts along the victim's limbs, allowing blood to drip onto bark paper effigies of the dead. Unlike the swift heart removals of other rituals, this was a slow exsanguination, tailored to the Aztec belief that the dead fed drop by drop. Modern pathologists studying skeletal remains from these ceremonies note the absence of defensive wounds, suggesting many victims entered trance-like states, perhaps induced by hallucinogenic ointments rubbed into their paper garments. What unsettles archaeologists most is the contrast with contemporary traditions. Today's Dia de Muertos altars feature smiling calaveras and favorite foods of the departed. Miquelhuatl's altars held far darker offerings. At the Templo Mayor, researchers found stone receptacles stacked with the finger bones of children, each wrapped in paper inscribed with the names of royal ancestors. These weren't random acts of cruelty but calculated transactions, the living bargaining for another year of protection from the hungry dead. The clay skulls, now displayed in Mexico's National Museum of Anthropology, still bear the fingerprints of the priests who molded them, their surfaces stained with secrets we're only beginning to decipher. The ritual's legacy lingers in ways most don't realize. When modern celebrants paint their faces as skeletons during Dia de Muertos, they unconsciously echo those ancient paper-clad victims. The marigold petals guiding spirits home, a gentler evolution of the blood trails that once led sacrifices to the altar. Even the sweet pan de muerto, with its crossbones of dough, is a softened relic of the flesh and bone reality the Aztecs confronted. Their Miquelhuatl wasn't about nostalgia but necessity, a night when the living and the dead renewed their pact, signed not in ink but in the only currency the gods would accept. The Pochteka moved in shadows, wealthy beyond measure yet forbidden to flaunt it. These merchant spies of the Aztec Empire conducted sacrifices far from the public spectacle of the Templo Mayor. In hidden courtyards behind unassuming adobe walls, they orchestrated rituals so lavish they rivaled imperial ceremonies, using wealth amassed from jade, feathers, and cocoa bean trades to honor Tlaloc, the hook-nosed god of merchants. The most infamous of these blood offerings unfolded in 1519, just weeks before Hernán Cortés's arrival, when 50 enslaved men and women were led into a private compound near Tlaloc's marketplace. Unlike the war captives sacrificed by the state, these victims were purchased specifically for the occasion, their value calculated not in military prowess but in pure currency, 22 cotton mantles per slave, a price recorded in the Codex Mendoza with chilling precision. Excavations at these merchant sites reveal a macabre attention to detail. Archaeologists uncovered ceramic masks depicting Tlalo's skeletal grin, their hollow eye sockets still smeared with a paste of crushed malachite and human blood. These weren't static idols but wearable ritual objects, donned by merchant elders during ceremonies described in colonial-era lawsuits as banquets of the damned. Accounts from a Spanish notary's report described tables laden with delicacies, chocolate foaming in golden cups, roasted turkey stuffed with amaranth set beside obsidian blades still sticky from use. The slaves, fed rich foods for weeks to plump their hearts, according to one witness, were killed not on stone altars but on woven mats symbolizing trade routes, their blood collected in conch shells used to anoint bundles of precious goods. What made the 1519 sacrifice extraordinary was its timing. The Pochteca, having intercepted reports of strange ships off the coast, interpreted Cortez's arrival as both omen and opportunity. By offering 50 lives, a number sacred to Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god, some mistook the Spanish, for they aimed to curry favor with whatever forces approached. Forensic analysis of the site shows victims were arranged in a quincunx pattern, 5 groups of 10 echoing the Aztec cosmological map. Their remains, when discovered in the 1990s, lay with ankles bound by rope dyed indigo, the color of elite trade. One skull still held a jade bead between its teeth, payment for the underworld's tollkeepers. The masks tell their own story. Recent spectrographic studies detected traces of theobromine, a compound found in chocolate, on their inner surfaces, suggesting priests consumed ritual beverages while wearing them. Some masks had hinged jaws that clacked during ceremonies, mimicking the sound of counting beans. Others bore intricate mosaics of spondylus shell, a rare material traded from distant coasts, each fragment a silent boast of mercantile reach. The most chilling discovery, miniature replicas of merchant packs, complete with tiny obsidian blades and vials of what testing revealed to be dried blood, buried alongside the dead, a merchant's toolkit for the afterlife. This underground sacrificial economy operated parallel to the state's official rites. Where imperial ceremonies celebrated martial glory, the Pochteca's rituals honored deception and negotiation. A mural at Teotihuacan depicts a merchant god whispering to a bound captive while weighing gold dust on a scale. A scene echoed in colonial codices describing how some slaves were chosen not for strength but for linguistic skills, their tongues removed as offerings to ensure profitable deals. The Pochteca understood what the warrior class often forgot, that words could be deadlier than blades, and that the most valuable sacrifices weren't always the loudest. Modern Mexico City's financial district now covers much of the Pochteca's sacred ground, but the artifacts endure as haunting reminders. One mask, displayed at the National Museum of Anthropology, has become notorious for an unsettling detailed fingerprint impressions in the blood clay, likely left by the last merchant to wear it. Under UV light, the stains resolve into a map of Mesoamerican trade routes, drawn in the very substance that financed them. It's a grim ledger of an empire built not just on conquest, but on the silent, systematic exchange of flesh for gold. The Cuacale, the Eagle House, stood silent before dawn as young warriors knelt on mats woven from enemy hair, their bodies painted in alternating stripes of ochre and chalk. This was no ordinary training ground. It was the sacred space where boys became jaguar and eagle warriors, the empire's elite. The initiation rites, vividly depicted in the Codex Mendoza, weren't just tests of strength, they were full reenactments of cosmic warfare, demanding each recruit prove himself not just as a fighter, but as a conduit for divine power. At the heart of the ritual lay the Cuauhxicalli, the eagle vessel, a stone bowl carved with gaping raptor beaks, its hollow waiting to receive the still steaming hearts of captives. Recent excavations near the Templo Mayor uncovered one such vessel, its interior stained with iron-rich hematite that mimicked dried blood even before its first use. The craftsmanship was staggering, the bowl's rim tapered to a knife's edge, symbolizing the razor-thin boundary between life and death that these warriors straddled. When a recruit placed his first sacrificial offering into this vessel, he wasn't just killing an enemy, he was feeding the sun itself, transforming violence into sacred sustenance. The costumes excavated from these sites reveal even more chilling details. A 16th-century jaguar warrior suit, preserved in a dry cave near Texcoco, still retains its spotted pelt, not from actual jaguar skin, but from human hair dyed yellow and black woven into a cotton base. The helmet's lower jaw clacked with real jaguar teeth, each one drilled and strung on sinew to rattle with every movement. But the true masterpiece was the back ornament, a wooden frame supporting hundreds of quetzal feathers arranged to ripple like muscle beneath fur, an illusion so convincing that Spanish chroniclers swore they saw the suits come alive during ceremonies. The initiation's climax was a brutal game of deception and endurance. Recruits disguised as enemy warriors were released into the wilderness beyond Tenochtitlan's borders. Their mission, to infiltrate real settlements and return with living captives just as their gods had done in mythic times. The Codex Mendoza shows these young men dragging prisoners by the hair, but recent forensic evidence suggests a darker truth. Skeletons found near old trade routes show healed fractures consistent with being bound and carried for miles, their bones marked not by battle wounds but by the systematic strain of forced marches. What's often overlooked is the psychological dimension. These weren't mindless thugs, they were performers in a sacred drama. Murals at Melanalco depict eagle warriors mid-transformation, their human eyes bleeding into avian pupils, their mouths elongating into beaks. The costumes weren't disguises but portals, each feather and claw carefully engineered to trigger altered states of consciousness. Spanish accounts describe initiates speaking in bird-like shrieks for days after the ritual, their voices returning only after priests cut the eagle's tongue with a ritual blade. The ultimate test came at dawn. Successful recruits stood before the Cuauhxicalli as priests slit their captives' throats, not the usual heart removal, allowing blood to fountain directly into the vessel. The warriors then dipped their hands into the steaming liquid, painting their faces with crimson streaks that dried into the permanent mark of their order. Modern spectroscopy on surviving warrior statues confirms the pigment was indeed hemoglobin-based, mixed with resin to adhere to skin. These men didn't just serve the empire, they became living reminders that every sunrise required sacrifice, every victory demanded payment in the only currency the gods accepted. The spring rains arrived late in 1483, and the priests knew what must be done. Along the shores of Lake Texcoco, families gathered with their children, not for celebration, but for Atlcahualo, the festival where the empire's youngest became Tlaloc's most sacred offerings. The air smelled of wet earth and crushed blossoms as priests painted the selected children with stripes of vibrant blue, the color of rushing water and storm clouds. These weren't random markings. Recent analysis of the blue pigment from Tlaloco's mass burials reveals it was made from ground azurite mixed with tree gum, a recipe so precise that it still clings to skeletal remains 5 centuries later. Each stroke was a prayer, transforming living children into divine messengers. The chosen ones were dressed in miniature versions of Tlaloc's regalia. Paper crowns shaped like lightning bolts, tiny jade beads strung around their necks to mimic the god's legendary jewels. Spanish friar Bernardino de Sahagun recorded mothers weaving flowers into their children's hair, a bittersweet act of love that served a grim purpose. The blooms weren't mere decoration but sensory triggers, marigolds to induce tears, their pungent oils irritating young eyes until droplets fell in steady streams. Tlaloc, the Aztecs believed, could only be moved by the purest sorrow, the kind that came unbidden from the smallest victims. Excavations near the Templo Mayor uncovered ceramic flutes shaped like weeping faces, their mouthpieces designed to amplify the sound of children's sobs into echoing wails that carried across the water. What happened next was methodical in its cruelty. The children were taken to stone ramps leading into the lake, their ankles weighted with carved clay spheres representing Tlaloc's hailstones. As priests chanted, attendants would gradually submerge them, pausing between each immersion to collect their tears in ritual bowls. Forensic anthropologists studying the Tlaloco burial site made a chilling discovery. Many of the children's sinus cavities were packed with blue sediment, suggesting they were held underwater just long enough to inhale lake water before being pulled gasping back to the surface, their frantic coughing producing more tears for collection. This cycle repeated until exhaustion or drowning stilled them. The promised reward was Tlaloc, a paradise where the rain god kept the souls of those who died by water. Murals at Teotihuacan depict this realm as a lush garden where children eternally climbed fruit-laden trees, their laughter bringing gentle showers to the mortal world. But the archaeological record reveals a darker duality. Many of the recovered child skeletons show signs of chronic illness or disability: cleft palates, twisted limbs, conditions the Aztecs believed made them especially beloved by Tlaloc. Their physical suffering wasn't hidden but highlighted, their perceived imperfections marking them as already touched by the divine. The most heartbreaking finds are the grave offerings. Tiny clay figurines of frogs and fish surrounded the bodies, each painted with the same azurite blue as the children's skin. Some graves contained miniature rafts made of reeds, complete with carved paddles, vessels for the soul's journey to Tlalocan. But the cruelest detail lies in the positioning of the bones. Unlike typical Aztec burials where bodies were laid flat, these children were arranged in fetal poses, their knees drawn tight against their chests as if returning to the womb of the world. Their mouths were often pried open post-mortem, jaws broken to insert jade beads, a final assurance they could speak to Tlaloc in the afterlife. Modern meteorologists note an eerie pattern when cross-referencing Aztec sacrificial records with climate data. Years with documented Atlcahulo ceremonies often saw heavier than average rainy seasons. Whether by divine intervention or grim coincidence, the Aztecs may have been right about one thing: sometimes the sky does weep in answer to the earth's sorrow. The slopes of Popocatépetl still bear the scars of ceremonies lost to time, blackened stone circles where fires burned hot enough to fuse volcanic rock into glass. This was Tepelhuatl, the festival where the Aztecs climbed impossibly high to meet their most temperamental gods. Unlike the grand spectacles of Tenochtitlan, these rituals were intimate horrors, performed where the air grew thin and the earth itself trembled. Victims chosen for their physical endurance were marched up the volcano's flanks, their bare feet leaving bloody prints on sharp obsidian shards deliberately scattered along the path. The higher they climbed, the more their suffering became an offering. Each labored breath, each stumble, another plea to the unpredictable mountain gods. Recent excavations near Popocatépetl's summit uncovered stone altars ringed with skeletal remains so thoroughly charred they crumbled at a touch. Forensic analysis revealed something chilling: the victims hadn't just been burned. Their bones showed patterns of extreme heat localized to the torso, suggesting they were placed alive onto slabs of volcanic basalt heated by subterranean vents. The positioning was deliberate, bodies curled in fetal positions around clay effigies of Zucotl, the fire serpent, their arms clutching the figures as if embracing their own destruction. Some skulls still held teeth clenched around chunks of sulfur, a final gift for the gods beneath the earth. What makes Tepelhuatl uniquely haunting is how it blended sacrifice with natural spectacle. The Aztecs timed these ceremonies to coincide with periods of volcanic activity, when Popocatépetl's smoking peak seemed most alive. Codex illustrations show priests reading the volcano's rumblings like divine speech. A deep tremor might signal approval, while an ash plume could demand additional victims. Modern volcanologists have noted an eerie correlation between these ancient rituals and seismic records. The years with the most extensive sacrificial deposits often preceded the mountain's most violent eruptions. Whether by luck or observation, the Aztecs recognized patterns even today's instruments struggle to predict. The rituals didn't end with death. After the bodies burned, priests collected bone fragments and powdered them with volcanic ash to create a sacred cement. This mixture was molded into tiny replicas of temples and buried in crevices along the volcano's rim, an architectural plea for stability. Archaeologists working near Paso de Cortés recently discovered one such cache: miniature pyramids no larger than a fist, their surfaces imprinted with fingerprints that DNA testing linked to the very victims whose bones composed them. The message was clear: even in annihilation, these souls would remain as eternal guardians, their essence fused with the mountain itself. Today's Day of the Dead celebrations near Popocatépetl still carry echoes of Tepelhuatl. Villagers craft elaborate sand mosaics called tapites, not knowing their designs mirror the ash patterns Aztec priests once scrawled around sacrificial altars. The marigold petals laid on graves are modern substitutes for the sulfur flowers victims once held. And when offerings of food are left at shrines, they're always placed on flat stones, unconscious recreations of those ancient heated slabs. The volcano still rumbles, the earth still trembles, and though no one climbs to meet the gods with bloodied feet anymore, the mountain remembers. Every eruption that shakes the valley is a reminder. Some contracts between humans and the divine can't be unmade, only rewritten in ash and memory. The Archaeology festival reached its climax at the foot of the Great Pyramid, where straw effigies swayed in the morning breeze, each one lashed to wooden frames with cords made from human hair. To the uninitiated, they might have looked like simple practice dummies, but the Florentine Codex reveals their true purpose. These were stand-ins for the gods themselves, their straw-stuffed limbs painted with the same sacred patterns worn by sacrificial victims. The archers who took their positions weren't mere warriors. They were priests trained from childhood in the art of Tlaloc, the flying arrow divination. Every shot carried cosmic weight, every twang of the bowstring a whispered question to the divine. The ritual began with eerie precision. Victims, often prisoners of war marked by exceptional agility, were tethered to rotating platforms that spun unpredictably, their bodies becoming living targets. Spanish chronicler Diego de Ron described how each captive wore a padded tunic painted with concentric circles, transforming them into human versions of the straw effigies. The archers used bows strung with sinew from previous sacrifices, their arrows tipped not with lethal obsidian but with blunted wood designed to bruise rather than kill. This was no straightforward execution. It was a deadly game of chance where the gods determined who lived or died through the arrow's paths. Divination lay at the heart of the spectacle. As the platform spun, priests chanted from the Codex Borgia's star charts, interpreting each arrow's trajectory as an omen. An arrow striking the left shoulder might foretell drought, while one grazing the right knee signaled impending war. The most feared outcome, a complete miss. This wasn't just failure, it meant the gods had turned their faces away, a portent so dire that additional sacrifices were immediately demanded. Forensic archaeologists studying skeletal remains from these ceremonies found healed fractures consistent with repeated blunt force trauma, proof that some victims endured multiple rituals before a lucky shot ended their ordeal. The straw effigies served as more than symbols. When retrieved after target practice, priests would dissect them, reading the arrow patterns in the scattered straw like celestial tea leaves. A bundle pierced through the abdomen might be displayed in temples as a warning, while one struck cleanly through the heart became a relic, its straw mixed with the blood of future victims to ensure accuracy. The Florentine Codex depicts this process in vivid detail, priests squatting over gutted dummies, their fingers tracing imaginary lines between puncture wounds like astronomers mapping constellations. What unsettles modern scholars is the ritual's psychological complexity. Victims weren't passive targets but active participants, conditioned through weeks of ritual fasting to embrace their role. Some accounts describe captives straining against their bonds to catch arrows with their bodies, believing a noble death here would grant them a place in the sun god's retinue. The spinning platforms themselves were engineering marvels. Recent reconstructions show they could reach dizzying speeds, making the archers' accuracy all the more uncanny. The Aztecs saw this not as cruelty but as cosmic dialogue, where every whizzing arrow carried a prayer and every gasp of pain was an answer. The legacy of Ochpanistli's arrow sacrifice lingers in unexpected ways. Modern Mexican festivals still feature torritos, spinning fireworks contraptions that shower sparks in wild patterns. a distant echo of those spinning platforms. The straw dummies, now crafted for target practice in rural marksmanship contests, retain traces of their grim ancestry in their painted designs. Even the concept of divination through chants persists. Some curanderos still toss arrows onto cloth to read fortunes, though the stakes are no longer life and death. The Aztecs understood something we often forget. That fate isn't written in stars or stones, but in the spaces between intention and impact, where every shot fired is both a question and an answer. The fields swayed golden under the mid-sun heat as 7 women processed toward the pyramid, their bare feet leaving faint impressions in the soft earth. Dressed in gowns of undyed cotton that glowed like ripe maize in the sunlight, they carried baskets of the season's first corn, each cob carefully arranged in groups of 7, the sacred number of Chikamacotl, the 7-serpent corn goddess. But these were no ordinary offerings. The women themselves were the sacrifice, chosen for their resemblance to the goddess's mythical daughters, their skin rubbed with ochre until they shimmered like living harvests. At the temple's summit waited priests in Xantl masks, grotesque wooden visages with hinged jaws that clacked like grinding teeth when moved. Recent excavations at Tlaloc uncovered one such mask, its interior still stained with layers of blue pigment and human saliva, the wood worn smooth from decades of use. The masks weren't static costumes but ritual devices, their hollow eye sockets fitted with polished obsidian lenses that refracted light into prismatic patterns, disorienting both wearer and victim. When the women knelt before them, the priests' distorted voices, amplified by the mask's resonating chambers, recited harvest invocations that echoed across the valley like wind through dry stalks. The killings unfolded with agricultural precision. Each woman was laid back onto a stone slab carved with 7 deep grooves, her arms outstretched to mimic a sprouting cornstalk. The obsidian blade struck not the heart but the throat, severing the carotid artery so blood would pulse rhythmically, a gruesome imitation of nourishing rain. The Florentine Codex captures this moment in chilling detail. The priests catching the arterial spray in wide-mouthed ceramic vessels shaped like Chikamacotl serpent heads, the blood mixing with sprouted maize kernels already inside. When the vessels were later buried in fields, the resulting hybrid of hemoglobin and germinating seeds was believed to birth the next season's crop. What makes these rites particularly unsettling are the Xantl mask's secret functions. Infrared scans reveal hidden compartments in their cheek panels, pockets that once held powdered hallucinogens, released when the priest licked the interior during ceremonies. Spanish accounts describe wearers speaking in tongues after prolonged use, their voices shifting eerily between masculine and feminine registers as if channeling both sower and sown. The mask's most disturbing feature, tiny obsidian blades embedded in the lower lip, tools for the priests to ritually husk their own tongues, drawing blood to mix with the victims in a symbolic pollination. The 7 cob motif recurs throughout Aztec art, but with a dark twist. Murals at Teopanzolco show cobs morphing into human spines, their kernels replaced by vertebrae. Excavated pottery depicts Chikamacotl wearing a skirt of flayed skin, the 7 cobs sprouting from its seams like a grisly garden. Even the baskets carried by the sacrificial women held coded meanings woven from split reeds in patterns that, when unfolded, mapped the empire's agricultural cycle. One such basket, preserved in a dry cave near Puebla, still contained remnants of the women's final meal, a porridge of amaranth and human milk, the same gruel fed to newborns. Modern geneticists studying Mesoamerican maize have noted an anomaly. Kernels from fields near ancient temple sites show unusual resistance to drought, a trait linked to high iron content in the soil. When they sampled the earth, the results were sobering, hemoglobin levels consistent with mass blood deposition. The Aztecs may not have understood microbiology, but their rituals tapped into an eerie truth: that death could indeed fertilize life, just not in the way they imagined. The corn goddess's final irony. Today's descendants still whisper prayers to Chikamacotl when planting, though the blood now comes from pricked fingers, not slit throats, a gentler echo of sacrifices that once turned entire fields crimson. The month of Tlaloc began with an unnatural hush, an entire city holding its breath, waiting for footsteps that might never come. Torches flickered low along Tenochtitlan's processional avenues, their smoke curling into shapes priests scrutinized for omens. This was the god's arrival, a sacred limbo when the Aztecs believed their deities abandoned the earth, leaving the world vulnerable to chaos. For 30 nights, priests and warriors kept vigil, their eyes raw from sleeplessness, their bodies smeared with ash to symbolize the void. But one figure stood apart: the Ixiptla, the god impersonator chosen to embody Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror. His transformation began the moment he was selected. Teeth filed to points, skin darkened with lamp black, his very identity erased to make room for divinity. What happened next wasn't merely ceremony, it was a calculated unraveling of the mind. Spanish chroniclers described how the Ixiptla was fed Tionanacatl, the flesh of the gods, hallucinogenic mushrooms carefully cultivated in temple crypts. Modern chemists analyzing residue on ceremonial bowls from the Templo Mayor identified psilocybin compounds mixed with chocolate and chili, a potent cocktail designed to accelerate spiritual communion. The effect was terrifyingly precise. Within hours, the impersonator would begin speaking in tongues, his pupils dilating until his eyes became two black mirrors reflecting nothing mortal. Murals at Melanalco depict this metamorphosis, a human figure mid-transformation, his limbs elongating into shadowy tendrils, his mouth stretched in a silent scream that may have been ecstasy or agony. The ritual's most haunting relics are the Yeyotl figure's stone effigies now housed in Mexico's National Museum of Anthropology. Carved from volcanic basalt, these twisted forms represent the god's dual nature. Some clutch their stomachs as if racked with divine nausea. Others grin with jagged teeth, their hollow eye sockets still stained with hematite to mimic dried blood. Archaeologists discovered them buried in concentric circles around the Templo Mayor, each figure positioned to watch the impersonator's final procession. Infrared scans revealed something chilling: their backs were incised with grooves designed to channel liquids, suggesting they once received offerings of the Ixiptla's blood or vomit during his mushroom-induced trances. As Tlaloc reached its climax, the impersonator's behavior grew erratic. The Florentine Codex describes him running through temples, his bare feet leaving soot-black prints on pristine limestone, a deliberate reenactment of Tezcatlipoca's mythic footsteps that brought both creation and ruin. Villagers scattered maize in his path, each kernel a prayer for his safe passage back to the divine realm. On the final night, his body exhausted from weeks of hallucinogens and fasting, he was led to a silent courtyard where the Yeyotl figures waited in a perfect square. There, under a moonless sky, priests used an obsidian blade to open his chest, not to remove the heart, but to release the god's breath. A single incision just deep enough to let his soul escape like smoke from a mirror. The aftermath blurred the line between reverence and horror. The body, now deemed an empty vessel, was dressed in the finery of a dozen gods' feathers of the Quetzal, jade beads from the underworld, a mask of turquoise mosaic, and propped upright among the Yeyotl figures for 3 more days. Spanish accounts mention the stench of decay mixing with copal incense, a scent so potent it clung to hair and clothing weeks later. When the flesh finally softened, priests collected the liquefied remains in ceremonial bowls, offering them to the earth as Tezcatlipoca's final gift, a grotesque communion between the divine and the dissolving. Today, tourists unknowingly walk over the very stones where these rituals unfolded. The Yeyotl figures, now behind glass, still bear the stains of their gruesome purpose. But perhaps the most haunting legacy lives on in modern ceremonies. In remote villages, curanderos still prepare Tionanacatl infusions, though the doses are gentler, the intentions less dire. Those who partake describe visions of a shadowy figure with mirrored eyes, proof that some doors, once opened, can never fully be closed. The Aztecs understood what modern science is only beginning to grasp, that the line between God and man, between sacrifice and transformation, is as thin as an obsidian blade's edge and just as sharp. The forests around Tenochtitlan echoed with the sound of rattling antlers as hundreds of war captives stumbled through the underbrush, their bodies painted in dappled brown and white patterns mimicking deer hides. This was Quecolli, the Hunter's Festival, a sacred reenactment of Mixcoatl's celestial chase, where the boundary between prey and predator dissolved in a blur of blood-stained flint. The captives weren't merely dressed as deer, they became them, with real antlers strapped to their heads and ankle bells that chimed with every panicked step, marking them for the gods as much as for their human pursuers. Archaeologists excavating sites near Texcoco have uncovered caches of ritual arrowheads that tell a chilling story. Unlike the obsidian blades used in temple sacrifices, these were crafted from golden chert, a stone chosen for its resemblance to the first light of dawn when Mixcoatl hunted the stars from the sky. Each point showed deliberate flaws, tiny notches along the edges designed to tear rather than cleanly pierce, prolonging the chase. Spanish chronicler Diego de Ron described how priests would ritually wound the sun god Tenochtitlan with these arrows before the hunt began, drawing first blood to sanctify the weapons. The same arrows would later find living targets, their jagged edges ensuring the captives bled vividly enough to paint the forest floor. The hunt itself was a meticulously staged cosmology. Captives were released in waves timed to celestial events, the first group at moonrise, the last at the precise moment Venus appeared above the horizon. As they crashed through the brush, warriors clad in jaguar pelts pursued them with bows strung with human hair, their every shot a reenactment of Mixcoatl firing arrows into the void to create the Milky Way. Murals at Teotihuacan depict this moment with eerie beauty, streaks of red pigment arching across a black background, each representing both an arrow's path and a new star born from sacrifice. What happened after the kill reveals the ritual's deeper symbolism. The deer men weren't simply left where they fell. Priests carefully arranged the bodies in star patterns, their antlers pointing toward specific constellations. Forensic analysis of mass graves near Tepoztlan shows skeletons with flint points still embedded in their vertebrae, proof they were pinned to the earth like celestial trophies. Their flayed skins, stretched over wooden frames, became sacred hunting maps. The natural markings on the hides were read as divine guidance for future expeditions. Even their blood served a purpose, mixed with copal and burned in ceremonial braziers. Its smoke was believed to rise directly to Mixcoatl's celestial hunting grounds. The festival's climax came when the warriors returned to Tenochtitlan, bearing not just trophies but transformation. Codex illustrations show hunters wearing necklaces strung with deer teeth and human finger bones, a fusion of prey and predator. Some warriors underwent ritual scarification, having arrow-shaped wounds carved into their shoulders to mark them as living conduits between the human and divine hunts. The most chilling relics are the whistling arrows discovered in temple caches. Their hollow shafts produced shrill tones when fired, replicating the screams of both deer and dying men. To the Aztecs, there was no difference. In Mixcoatl's world, every chase ended the same way, with blood on the stars and the universe renewed by the hunt. The pulse of the Teponaztli drums throbbed through the temple precinct as the wine flowed freely. Not just any wine, but octly fermented with sacred herbs that blurred the lines between revelry and ritual. This was Pilahuana, the fertility ceremony so scandalous that Spanish friar Bernardino de Sahagun struggled to describe it without crossing himself repeatedly in his Florentine Codex entries. The air hung thick with the musky scent of copal and sweat as men and women, their bodies painted with swirling patterns of red and yellow, moved in rhythms that mirrored the planting cycles of maize. What began as solemn prayers to Xochipilli and Xochiquetzal, the twin deities of flower and desire, quickly spiraled into something far more visceral, a living enactment of creation itself. The Teponaztli drums at the heart of the ceremony weren't mere instruments but sacred timekeepers carved from hollowed logs, their surfaces etched with scenes of entwined couples. Recent excavations near Texcoco uncovered one such drum still stained with ochley and a darker substance. Forensic analysis confirmed it was human saliva mixed with trace elements of copper, likely from the lip ornaments worn by drummers. Sahagun's accounts describe how the beat started slow, mimicking the measured pace of agricultural work, then accelerated into a frenzied tempo that dissolved social barriers. Nobles and commoners, warriors and weavers all became equal in the dance, their movements growing increasingly uninhibited as the night wore on. What shocked the Spanish wasn't just the public intimacy, but the ritual's intentional disarray. Participants wore masks of twisted bark paper that disintegrated as the ochley soaked into them, symbolizing the shedding of societal constraints. Archaeologists have found caches of these dissolved masks in ceremonial pits, their fibers matted with blue pigment from body paint. The liquid itself, fermented from megi sap and laced with hallucinogenic morning glory seeds, was served in vessels shaped like blooming flowers, their stems hollowed to function as drinking tubes. Chemical residue tests reveal some cups contained additional additives, from ground orchid bulbs, a known aphrodisiac, to traces of volcanic ash believed to heat the blood. The climax of Pilahuana defies simple categorization. Sahagun's informants spoke of pairs disappearing into the surrounding fields, their couplings not just permitted but sanctified as acts of cosmic fertilization. The Teponaztli's rhythm reached a fever pitch at dawn when priests collected the mingled fluids, sweat, wine, and other emissions, to sprinkle over freshly plowed earth. Modern excavations at temple sites have uncovered strange, spongy layers in the soil, decades of organic deposits from these rituals, so rich in nitrogen that wildflowers still grow there in unnatural profusion. Yet for all its apparent chaos, Pilahuana followed strict symbolic rules. The positions of dancers mirrored constellations associated with fertility. The number of drumbeats corresponded to sacred calendrical cycles. Even the post-ritual cleanup was ceremonial. Participants were scrubbed with amul root by temple attendants, their bodies purified for re-entry into structured society. The Spanish saw debauchery, but the Aztecs recognized a profound truth: that creation is messy, that life springs from abandon as much as order. The drums, now silent in museum cases, still bear the fingerprints of those who played them, each groove a testament to the night the gods walked among mortals, not as distant idols but as partners in the dance. The final days of the Aztec solar calendar held a terror unlike any sacrificial rite. A stretch of 5 ominous days known as Nemontemi, when the gods turned their faces away and the universe hung in precarious silence. These weren't merely days of rest, but a gaping void in the cosmic order, a time so dangerous that even the priests dared not spill a single drop of blood. The counted bundle calendar sticks, recently unearthed near Tlaloc, tell the story in knotted cords and painted glyphs. The last 5 knots always dyed black, their fibers frayed from generations of anxious handling. During Nemontemi, the usual rhythms of Tenochtitlan ground to a halt. No fires were lit, no crops planted, no children born if families could help it. The Codex Fejavari Mayor depicts these days as a skeletal figure curled around the calendar wheel, its hollow ribs cradling the 5 empty spaces. Spanish chroniclers described citizens barricading themselves indoors, whispering prayers through cloth masks to avoid inhaling the malevolent spirits said to roam freely. Even the temples stood eerily still. Obsidian blades remained sheathed, sacrificial stones cold for the first and only time all year. The fear wasn't superstition but mathematical dread. The Aztec solar year spanned 360 days, leaving those 5 fateful days unaccounted for, a numerical flaw that mirrored their belief in the universe's fragile equilibrium. Archaeologists examining calendar sticks at the National Museum of Anthropology noticed something telling. The blackened knots representing Nemontemi were often retied over older ones, as if attempting to reinforce their structural integrity. The Aztecs understood what modern astronomers confirm: calendars are human constructs, and nature's cycles don't always conform neatly to our counts, yet within this terror lay profound sophistication. The Nemontemi days weren't scattered randomly but clustered at year's end, functioning as a cosmic reset before the new cycle began. Murals at Teotihuacan show priests performing a meticulous inventory during this time, checking seed stores, repairing temples, and most crucially, bundling the past year's ritual objects into sacred packets. Excavations have revealed these bundles beneath temple floors, carefully wrapped parcels containing spent bloodletters, frayed sacrificial cords, and even the ashes of burned offerings. The message was clear: this was no mere intermission, but a sacred act of composting where the spiritual residue of one year fertilized the next. Modern mathematicians analyzing the calendar sticks have made an eerie discovery. The Nemontemi alignment created a built-in correction system. By compressing the hollow days into one block rather than dispersing them, the Aztecs minimized cumulative error over decades. Their solution predates the Gregorian calendar's leap year by centuries. But for the average citizen, this mathematical brilliance offered little comfort. Household artifacts from the period reveal private coping mechanisms: clay figurines of the hearth goddess Chantico buried under doorways, amaranth dough effigies eaten in protective rituals. Even the counting sticks themselves were often stored in triple-layered pouches during Nemontemi, as if containing radioactive material. The true horror of these days emerged in their aftermath. When dawn finally broke on the new year, priests scrutinized the sunrise for omens. A warbling bird call might signal coming famine, while a blood-red horizon promised war. The Florentine Codex describes the first sacrifice after Nemontemi as especially brutal, as if compensating for the cosmic debt incurred during the silent days. Victims were chosen for their numerical symbolism: 5 captives to balance the 5 voids, their hearts offered in rapid succession like spiritual interest payments. What lingers most isn't the fear, but the philosophical weight the Aztecs attached to emptiness. In a civilization obsessed with filling the universe's hunger through constant sacrifice, these 5 days forced a confrontation with the void itself. The counted bundle sticks now displayed in museums aren't just timekeeping tools, they're existential artifacts. Their black knots a reminder that even the most meticulously ordered systems contain gaps where chaos seeps in. Today, as we reset our own digital calendars with effortless swipes, we've lost what the Aztecs understood viscerally. That time isn't just a measurement, but a trembling agreement between humans and the indifferent cosmos. The sand of the gladiatorial arena glittered under the harsh sun as war captives staggered forward, their ankles hobbled by ritual cords, their bodies painted in the stripes of their defeated city-states. This was Tlacaxi, the flaying of men, but before the knives touched flesh, there came the Xochitl, the flowery battle. Far from a fair fight, this ritual combat was a macabre theater where bound prisoners became living offerings in a duel staged between earth and sky. Spanish friar Diego Duran's accounts describe how each captive was given a mock weapon: a wooden sword edged with feathers instead of obsidian, a club padded with cotton. Opposite them stood fully armed eagle and jaguar warriors, their obsidian-edged macuahuitl swords glinting. The outcome was never in doubt. The captives fought not for survival, but for the honor of dying well, their struggle symbolizing the eternal war between the forces of order and chaos. Recent excavations at the Templo Mayor uncovered the very arena where these fights occurred: a circular platform with grooves designed to channel blood toward a central stone. Ghostly stains still marked the surface, their iron content so high that ground-penetrating radar revealed tendrils of oxidized blood reaching deep into the temple foundations. At the arena's heart stood the Quetzalcoatl, the eagle vessel. This wasn't merely a bowl, it was a masterpiece of sacred engineering. Carved from basalt in the shape of an eagle with outstretched wings, its hollowed back served as the receptacle for hearts. The Florentine Codex details how each victor's blade would plunge into a captive's chest, the extracted organ placed still pulsing into the vessel's depression, where steam would rise like an eagle's spirit taking flight. Museum scans of surviving Quetzalcoatl show microscopic striations from countless blades, their patterns revealing the precise angle priests used 17 degrees downward to avoid damaging the sternum, a technique perfected through generations. The Spanish recoiled at what they called the escudos voladores, flying shields, moments when victorious warriors would raise the Quetzalcoatl high, letting blood cascade down their arms as they mimicked eagles in mid-strike. But what conquistadors saw as savagery held profound symbolism. The captives' final moments were choreographed to mirror the mythical battle where the sun god Huitzilopochtli defeated the stars at dawn. Each drop of blood became a fallen star, each gasp the wind that carried the sun across the sky. Forensic archaeologists made a chilling discovery when analyzing the arena's soil layers of pollen mixed with hemoglobin, evidence that victims' blood was sprinkled with flowers to sweeten their passage to the afterlife. The captives' bindings, often preserved in sacrificial caches, tell another story. Some fibers show signs of being gnawed, suggesting many fought their restraints until the end. The most haunting relic is a Quetzalcoatl now displayed in Mexico City's National Museum of Anthropology. Under ultraviolet light, its surface reveals handprints invisible to the naked eye but glowing faintly under the right spectrum. These aren't the marks of priests but of the victims themselves, their blood leaving biochemical signatures no amount of time can erase. The Aztecs believed these men didn't truly die. Their energy merely transformed, fueling the eternal struggle between darkness and light, one heartbeat at a time. The year 1487 dawned with a sense of foreboding in Tenochtitlan. Emperor Moctezuma Roman II had spent months deciphering omens, a comet splitting the night sky like a wound, strange towers of flame erupting from Lake Texcoco's surface, even reports of a two-headed bird dragged from the water, its wings beating in impossible unison. The Codex Florentino preserves these signs in vivid detail, the scribes' hands trembling as they inked images of collapsing temples and weeping statues. For Moctezuma, these weren't mere oddities, they were divine warnings, signals that the cosmic balance was fracturing. His response would become the bloodiest single ritual in Aztec history, the reconsecration of the Great Pyramid, a 4-day slaughter so vast that Spanish chroniclers later claimed you could smell the iron tang of blood miles downstream. Recent excavations at the Templo Mayor have unearthed chilling evidence of this event. Beneath the current archaeological layers, a stratum of blackened earth marks the 1487 sacrifices, packed with shattered obsidian blades and charred human remains. Forensic anthropologists working the site made a macabre discovery. The victim profiles changed dramatically as the ritual progressed. The initial layers contained typical war captives, their bones showing old battle scars. But in higher strata, the skeletons grew increasingly diverse. Women with ceremonial jade inlays in their teeth, children buried with ornate figurines, even elderly individuals displaying signs of chronic illness. It seems Moctezuma's desperation widened the scope of acceptable offerings, a silent admission that the gods demanded more than the usual tribute. The scale of engineering alone boggles the mind. Archaeologists calculating the pyramid's staircase dimensions estimate that with 4 priestly teams working in shifts, a victim could be sacrificed every 15 seconds, a rate that would have required an assembly line of attendants to clean blades, haul bodies, and keep the blood flowing in uninterrupted rivulets down the steps. The Codex Florentino's illustrators captured this grotesque efficiency. priests with blood-slicked hair passing obsidian knives hand to hand like farm tools during harvest, while nobles at the pyramid's base used reeds to siphon gore into ceremonial canals. What separates this massacre from earlier rituals is its underlying terror. Normally, Aztec sacrifices carried an aura of divine certainty. The universe's hunger would be sated, the sun would rise. But the artifacts from 1487 tell a different story. Offerings became increasingly frantic, jade masks smashed mid-ceremony, golden ornaments hastily stuffed into victims' mouths rather than placed reverently. One especially poignant find was a cluster of ceramic flutes, their mouthpieces still bearing tooth marks from musicians who likely played until their lips bled, attempting to drown out the screams with sacred music. The most haunting evidence comes from dental analysis. Isotopic studies on victims' teeth revealed many weren't foreign captives but local Aztec commoners, possibly volunteers convinced their deaths could stave off impending doom. Their remains were treated with unusual care, bundled in expensive textiles, surrounded by heirlooms usually reserved for nobility. This wasn't just sacrifice, it was a civilization attempting to bargain with fate, offering up its very soul in exchange for more time. When the Spanish arrived 3 decades later, they misinterpreted these preparations as primitive superstition. They didn't understand that Moctezuma hadn't been awaiting conquerors, but something far worse: the end of the fifth sun, the collapse of the cosmic order itself. The Templo Mayor's final pre-Hispanic sacrifices weren't acts of barbarism, but of heartbreaking faith, a last attempt to hold back the darkness with nothing but outstretched hands and rivers of blood. Even now, walking those excavated passages, you can almost hear the echoes not of screams, but of prayers whispered into the void. For 2 centuries, these 30 dark rituals formed the beating heart of the Aztec Empire, not just acts of devotion, but the very glue holding their cosmos together. Every flayed skin, every shattered flute, every drop of blood spilled down pyramid steps was a calculated transaction with forces we've long forgotten how to see. The Aztecs built a civilization on the principle that life demanded death in return, that the sun wouldn't rise without the steam of freshly extracted hearts rising to meet it. Their rituals weren't the madness of bloodthirsty fanatics, but the desperate calculus of a people who genuinely believed they alone kept the universe from collapsing into eternal night. Modern Mexico carries this legacy like a phantom limb, both repelled and fascinated by what lies beneath its Spanish colonial surface. Walk through Mexico City today and you'll see it everywhere. The National Museum of Anthropology displays obsidian blades with the same reverence given to Renaissance art. Schoolchildren sketch the Templo Mayor ruins on field trips, and Dia de Muertos celebrations echo ancient Miquelhuitantli rites with papier-mâché skulls instead of real ones. Yet ask locals about human sacrifice, and reactions split like a flint knife through cartilage. Some shudder at the barbarity, while others whisper that their ancestors understood truths about life's fragility that modern comforts have erased. Perhaps the most striking evidence of this duality lies in the excavations themselves. When workers digging Mexico City's subway in 1978 struck the massive stone disk of Coyolxauhqui, the dismembered moon goddess, construction halted for years as archaeologists swarmed the site. Today, that discovery spot is both a museum and a pilgrimage site where grandparents bring flowers to honor ancestors they'll never name aloud, and teenagers snap selfies with the same stone that once ran slick with sacrificial blood. The Aztecs may have vanished, but their worldview lingers in the way Mexicans still bargain with forces beyond their control, whether leaving coins at shrines to Santa Muerte or lighting candles for lost loved ones during November's chill. Which leaves us with an uncomfortable question that echoes far beyond Mesoamerica. Is ritual violence humanity's oldest coping mechanism? From the Celtic Wicca men to Carthaginian child sacrifices, from Viking blood eagles to Japanese kamikaze, civilizations across time have offered lives to gods we no longer recognize. The Aztecs were neither the first nor the last to believe that survival required payment in flesh. As our modern world grapples with drone strikes and school shootings, we might ask, have we truly outgrown the need for sacred violence, or have we just found new alternatives?